You're listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hello, everyone. I am Erwin Dekker, Senior Research Fellow with the Mercatus Center, and today I'm joined by Malte Dold, Assistant Professor of Economics at Pomona College, and he's here with me to talk about ordoliberalism. He is the second one in a short series about ordoliberalism. Malte, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Erwin.
So ordoliberalism, let's just jump right in. What does that mean to you, and why should we care about this tradition of what is typically conceived of as a sort of German liberal school of economics?
So ordoliberalism can be understood as a political economy tradition that emerged in predominantly German-speaking academia in the 1930s, which was the interwar period, a time of political instability, economic instability, social instability, and ordoliberals considered that as a crisis of modernity. Actually, right? There were the economic, social, and political turmoils of the Weimar Republic. There were pending fascist and communist movements, mass unemployment, hyperinflation, and generally speaking, economic depression. And ordoliberals, said we need an answer as liberals to those historical developments. Now, the obvious question is, what does the cryptic ordo mean when you combine it with liberal? Now, the liberal part is maybe the easier one, right? The liberal reaction is really a reaction against the extreme views at the time on the right, which was fascism, and on the left, it was communism. The liberals sought to oppose power concentrations by enabling what they thought is a privilege-free, equal participation in both markets and politics. So that's the liberal idea. Now, what is the ordo idea? That's a bit more difficult, but the reference to ordo can be understood as a distance to the unregulated laissez-faire liberalism of the 19th century, and the explicit endorsement of the idea that markets must be embedded in non-market institutions, particularly legal institutions, but also educational institutions, religious institutions, the media, civil society at large. Now, a core idea also when we think of order is the idea of a strong state. Now, a strong state is not an authoritarian state, but actually a state of limited government that is non-corruptible, right, by private interests. And the task of the state is then to basically provide and enforce general rules of the game, right? And importantly, to do so by little intervention into the process, into the market and social process itself. So this is sort of like a combination of the liberal idea on the one hand and the ordo idea on the other hand. And let me just add one thing. Ordoliberalism is by no means a monolithic tradition, right, that speaks with one voice. And there are multiple strands, but roughly speaking, there are two camps. On the one hand, there is the law and economics tradition of the Freiburg School of Economics, as represented most prominently by Walter Eucken and Franz Bohm, which focuses on the discussion of the right set of rules for competitive economic order. And on the other hand, there is a more sociological version of ordoliberalism that was basically propagated by Wilhelm Röpke and Alexander Rüstow most prominently, which highlights the necessary social roots of a stable liberal order and institutions such as the family, the church, and civil society become core core targets of analysis. So this is roughly speaking.
So if I can just follow up on that, do they also have a different concept of order if the one thinks more along legal lines and the other more along sociological lines?
Well, yes. I mean, in the sense that one has to be a bit careful with the expression, right? Because originally, neither of these two strands that I just mentioned coined the term order, right? It was an exposed attribution of those strands. But of course, you can see a different emphasis here. If you think of the law and economics tradition of the Freiburg School, you naturally get an emphasis on the legal order as sort of the focal point for a lot of like social processes, right? And if you think about the sociological strand, you can understand that order is not first and foremost a stable legal order, but might actually be a social order, where tradition plays a role, right? Where, the social organization plays a role. And you could maybe understand that much more as a bottom-up approach to order, right? The sociological approach, rather than the, bit more top-down understanding of order of the law and economics tradition of the Freiburg School.
Yeah. And was there then an idea that somehow these other orders were being eaten up or so, or being threatened by the economy of the interwar period? Or what was precisely the idea that these other orders needed to be reinforced?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned at the outset this general fear that there was a threat to civilization and modernity, and an instability there. And one core problem that unites all strands of ordoliberalism is actually this upcoming, mass society, mass culture, mass politics, etc., where an unordered process, if you just have sort of like an evolutionary process of these mass developments, we might end up with situations that ultimately might not be liberal. Now, what could that be? Well, obviously, if you think about the social and political movements at the time, it could be radical political movements that disrespect individual rights, right? That could be one. But there's also sort of a complicated history, particularly when you look at the sociological strand of ordoliberalism, with consumerism, with mass media, with a lot of aspects what we nowadays would consider part and parcel of a modern complex society, and ordoliberals had in that sense a more conservative ring sometimes to them, and understood themselves as a reaction to these new movements that would disrupt old social structures.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
I think, sorry, just to follow up on that, I mean, why should we care, right? I think you asked that. I mean, you could say, just my last remark was, isn't that, sort of maybe something that people in the 1930s cared about, particularly those that had a slight conservative preference for old social structures, wanted to go to pre-Weimar time in that sense. Well, I think, obviously, and this is not only me thinking that the recent rise in populism across the West sort of puts the fragility and instability of the liberal order back on the political agenda, but also on the academic agenda. And think of populist movements in the West, such as Brexit, but also Donald Trump in the US. That was a real blow, right, to the liberalism and liberal scholarship at the time. And there was a lot of soul searching among liberal scholars, since liberal elites, or their ideas at least, were often blamed for, our socioeconomic evils, including, inequality, If you think about the inequality between an urban elite and the left behinds in rural areas, but also other things such as climate change, right, or market concentration in the tech industry. And often the liberal ideas, right, were blamed for these developments. Now, there are two questions I think that we need to answer. One is, if this critique is justified, then can actually liberals, and particularly ordoliberals, learn from mistakes and come up with a contemporary version of liberalism that convinces people? And second, if actually the critique is unjustified, how can you better sell your core ideas as liberals in the political process?
It also sounds like they had an idea where somehow an initial state of competition and openness, or an initial state of individualism and sort of social norms that emphasize individual responsibility, would not necessarily be stable over time. So they could, I don't know, be corrupted by the circumstances or be corrupted over time, and then you had to restore it somehow to a more competitive or more individualist sort of cultural set of beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, this is I think an under-researched area still. I mean, in the sense that your question is well taken, because if we take the law and economics tradition of the Freiburg school, what you would get is a superficial reading could be something like, well, you just need the right legal institutional framework, right, that installs some sense of stability and some sense of competition in the economy, and then everything else is okay, right?
Yeah.
What obviously the more sociological strand of ordoliberalism would argue is we cannot just think in economic terms when we think about the stability of the liberal order, right? On some level, you need to also consider whether liberal values are inculcated in the citizens who ultimately are responsible in supporting the liberal order. And I'm not sure whether actually the sociological strand of ordoliberalism had the right answers here. Advocating for, like, in a way, small shopkeepers, artisans, etc., which sounded a bit like a pre-industrial and pre-industrialized version of a society, and might not be a powerful answer in a complex modern society. But I think the diagnosis from an analytical point of view is well taken, that a purely economic or economistic approach to the question of the stability of a liberal order might actually miss important cultural and social questions.
Yeah. So if we would take it to the present, right, we would also think that something like the rise of a knowledge economy or even of a gig economy would create a different set of social circumstances also that will have an impact on the type of individualism or the type of social ties that people build, and that then has an important, broader social consequence.
Yes, and absolutely. And in fact, even like when we look at people that supported this law and economics tradition, like Walter Eucken, right? And obviously that predates all the stuff that you just mentioned. Think about social media, think about developments in communication, etc. of the last few decades. But what is important is sort of the general insight that thinking in orders means that orders are interdependent, right? That we do not just have the economic order that we can analyze independently from, let's say, the world of social communication, but there is a clear overlap and mutual influence. What we obviously can see nowadays, and ordoliberal analysis of this, an ordoliberal analysis of this situation would clearly understand that the type of individualism that we get in a liberal society depends on how we structure these mutually interdependent social orders, right?
Yeah. Okay. I want to go back for a moment to something you said earlier, because I called it a school of economics, and then you said, no, it's a school of political economy. And I want to unpack a little bit what that difference is. I know that in some of your work you have emphasized that the ordoliberals essentially have a normative or a value-laden program. So is that what you mean when you say you call them a school of political economy, that values and normative considerations are always part of the economic analysis?
That's very much a reason why I said it's actually political economy tradition. If you think about, obviously, when political economy traditions that are very well known in the Anglo-American world, it would be the Scottish Enlightenment tradition of political economy of Smith and others. And Smith obviously was not just an economist, but also a moral philosopher. And in the same way, I do understand the scholarship of ordoliberalism being a political economy tradition. And I think sort of that it's normative and explicitly value-laden is actually not a bad thing. When we look at current discussions about the instability of the liberal order, well, people are not just looking for economic arguments, right? They're looking for cultural and political arguments to overcome the current crisis of the liberal order, and also for a lot of economists. Actually, I think it's not a bad thing to be intellectually transparent and honest about your normative commitments. Right now, what are the most distinctive features of the ordoliberalism when it comes to normative commitments? Broadly speaking, I think the first one is one that comes with the breadth of the political economy program. And it is not a narrow technocratic program, but it really tries to tackle big questions regarding, the good society or well-functioning economy. And there are a couple of normative commitments, that are interesting. And I want to highlight a few of them by referring to different thinkers. And let me start with Walter Eucken, being, the most well-known proponent, particularly of the Freiburg School. The interesting thing is, in his principles of economic policy, that unfortunately I think is still not translated in English or is about to be translated. But anyway, he starts the whole treatise by saying that social security and social justice are the greatest concerns of our time, right? That motivates our economic analysis. And interestingly, he says that ordoliberalism is normatively committed to a functional and humane order. Now, what does that mean? Well, functional, for economists means basically the implementation of economic principles with the goal of efficiency, right? Overcoming some sort of scarcity problem. But the humane part is interesting. That means that you also, as an ordoliberal political economist, you consider principles, ethical principles of fairness that enable basically the self-determined and dignified life of individuals. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but the important thing is that the economic order is also seen through an ethical lens, and the ethical lens is one that emphasizes human flourishing and a dignified life, right? And to put it maybe in Deirdre McCloskey's terms, that the common man is given a go, right? Is very much also a radical egalitarian starting point of ordoliberal scholarship. And that's interesting. And obviously, when we talk about that, we also have to talk about how much emphasis there is on power in the ordoliberal tradition, right? And particularly, getting rid of power when we analyze social and political games. Now, the core idea here is obviously the idea of competition, right? As sort of the instrument that is an instrument of, the German term would be Entmachtungsinstrument, which means an instrument of the deprivation of power, basically, right? That allows not just, and this is important, not just for economic efficiency, but particularly for the core egalitarian idea to establish some form of equality of opportunity when it comes to both the market game and the political game.
So
sorry, that's Walter Eucken. That's Walter Eucken.
No. Yeah. So I was going to ask about the other thinkers, because I'm interested. Do they have other normative commitments than Walter Eucken does?
So the interesting thing is, Walter Eucken, you could say, well, that's a rather abstract thing, a functional and humane order. And the interesting thing is, obviously, Eucken himself comes up with what he calls constitutive and regulative principles of the economic order. Now, somehow these principles, including, a stable currency, open markets, the protection of private property, they drop a little bit like manna from heaven, right? In the sense that him, as an enlightened economist, he comes up with these principles that he thinks lead to a humane and functional social order. Now, Victor Warnberg, being sort of like a very prolific ordoliberal scholar over the last 3-4 decades, said ordoliberals need to ground those constituting principles that Eucken came up with in a contractarian logic, right? So in the sense, what Warnberg does is to say the normative commitments of ordoliberals is one that takes voluntary agreements of individuals seriously, that leads him to advocate for consumer sovereignty as a guiding normative principle in the economic realm, and citizen sovereignty as a guiding normative principle in the political realm. And consumer sovereignty, by and large, would mean, a situation in which consumers' common interests are the principal, quote unquote, controlling force of market activity. And citizen sovereignty would be a situation in which citizens' common interests are the principal controlling force of the political realm. Now, that would be sort of like an explicit normative commitment to contractarian logic and the twin ideas of consumer and citizen sovereignty.
That sounds a lot like Buchanan, right? Because on this podcast, we've talked a lot about the public choice school and about Buchanan's contractarianism. Are they close to one another?
So what Victor Warnberg tries to do in his advancement of ordoliberalism is basically marrying, on the one hand, Buchanan's contractarianism with Hayek's, more evolutionary approach to economics. And in that sense, recent scholarship on ordoliberalism building on Warnberg can be very much seen as trying to build a bridge between constitutional economics or constitutional political economy of Buchanan and the ordoliberalism of the last 20 years or so. And there are a lot of commonalities. I think there are a few differences also that we might want to highlight. One is that, when you look at constitutional political economy and people also writing the tradition of Buchanan, you see an emphasis on the discussion of how to rein in political excesses, right? So really, how to come up with rules for the political game. I'm simplifying here. And ordoliberals, by and large, often focus more on how can you actually come up with rules for the market, right? In order to prevent power concentrations in the market. And I think there is a real difference in emphasis when you look at just the scholarship, right? The public choice scholarship focuses more on the political game and how to come up with rules there. And ordoliberals often discuss more the market and might neglect to some degree, actually, the rules for the political game. I don't think, by the way, that this is necessarily due to a lack of emphasis in the work of the Freiburg School. Both Eucken and Böhm were very much aware of the problems of political power concentrations if you do not come up with the right rules for the political game. But there's a difference in emphasis here. And I also think there's a difference in emphasis when it comes to the more sociological understanding of ordoliberalism compared to a more economic understanding of rules in constitutional political economy. I think ordoliberals always understood that when we think about the stability of the liberal order, we cannot just think about the economic rules of the game. We also have to think about how we structure, education, how we structure media, how we structure civil society. And I think that's a real, again, a difference in emphasis here when we compare constitutional political economy with the ordoliberal scholarship.
I mean, but this moves also right into your own work, because you've done quite a bit on looking into how Buchanan thought about individuals. So would you say that this is a blind spot of Buchanan, this development of individuality and his excessive focus on political rules, or is that not the way to understand it?
Now, it's true, in my own work, I, sympathetically criticize Buchanan for not emphasizing the social aspects when it comes to his discussion of individuality and individualism. And let me just start with a general point here. I think the late Buchanan saw actually a lot of these aspects, but I think that the public choice Buchanan of the 60s and 70s didn't really emphasize the point that I'm about to make. Now, Buchanan argues, by and large, right, the Homo economicus model is a uniquely appropriate caricature of human behavior when we analyze, political and economic institutions.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. Now, obviously, there are good arguments that Buchanan and other public choice scholars have on their side to stress the Homo economicus assumption. One is, if we assume it in the market for a typical market analysis, we might also have to assume it when we analyze, the political game, and the assumption of behavioral symmetry. But I think there's also real danger if you do that. And the danger is actually one that Buchanan himself saw. Buchanan himself, in an article entitled "The Ethics of Constitutional Order," in that article, he argues that it is basically meaningless to talk about constitutional change unless individuals are actually motivated to think about the existing legal political rules that affect their lives. Now, obviously, Homo economici might not think at all about, how to change the institutions and the rules of the game. Why? Because it's quite costly. So there's actually always that tension, a free rider problem. Who actually will be active in the political game? And interesting. Who will vote? That's right. Who will vote? One of the conundrums in the public choice literature. Why should you vote at all? Why should you discuss? Why should you engage in public discussions? Why should you go to committee meetings if you're an academic, right? But the interesting thing is, Buchanan himself said, ultimately, the liberal order will rely on the citizens' ethical obligation to enter into an ongoing constitutional dialogue. And that's interesting, right? So he diagnoses that, but I think he doesn't then sufficiently discuss the institutional prerequisites to allow individuals and to motivate individuals to enter into that constitutional dialogue. And in fact, when you think, for example, about the scholarship of Sam Bowles in his book, The Moral Economy, there's a real danger when you think about institutions only from the perspective of the Homo economicus model, because you might ultimately come up with maybe institutional setups that crowd out those intrinsic motivations to engage, in public discussions, moral dialogue, and ultimately constitutional choice. And I think that is something that I tend to emphasize in my own work, how much scholars who are interested in the stability of the liberal order must engage with a more realistic model of the individual that takes also the moral, or the capability of moral reasoning seriously, and doesn't just think of individuals as a bunch of Homo economici.
Yeah. So if we bring this back to ordoliberalism, they have sometimes been accused, perhaps even by myself, of a certain elitism when it comes to the governors. And now in Buchanan, you sort of sketch an idea that all the individuals must be involved in this political process. Is that also the commitment of the ordoliberals, or do they have an image of sort of enlightened lawmakers or perhaps constitutional reformers that is somewhat more elitist, or perhaps a kind of distribution of intellectual labor sort of image, where it's a smaller group that does the constitutional reform rather than all of society?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I just want to refer to Kenneth Dyson's work in this context, who has written and published his book on conservative liberalism, ordoliberalism, and the state. And what Dyson nicely does in the book, I think, is to show that ordoliberalism can be understood as a branch of conservative moral philosophy that subscribes to some, form of aristocratic liberalism. What does that mean? Well, clearly it emphasizes, things such as character, virtue, and the noble pursuit of disinterested truth, in opposition to, let's say, materialism, positivism, utilitarianism, and others. And if you do that, you also see that, well, probably not everybody can do that. Not everybody can have a strong character, be virtuous, and committed to a noble pursuit of disinterested truth. And it is sort of the enlightened elite that sort of leads the masses. And I think there's a real tension with this radical egalitarian idea, right, that I sketched before, and that sometimes has the ring of being elitist, as you rightly said. And the problem, obviously, is when we now analyze this question from the perspective of the last 10 years or so, we see that, well-meaning liberal elite came up with, rules for, let's say, free trade, rules for how we should govern banks, rules for how we, you name it, right? But a lot of citizens don't feel reflected in those rules, right? There seems to be sort of like an underlying tension in this approach when it comes to selling it to the common woman and common man in the street. And I think that's so your question is spot on. It's a question that ordoliberals need to tackle, right? And ultimately, if they take the idea of citizen sovereignty seriously, they also need to take the voice of the common man and women in the street seriously. And ultimately to ask, how can you empower these voices, right? Rather than come up with intelligently designed top-down rules that implement, allegedly ordoliberal ideas.
But this notion of citizen sovereignty, in some sense, sounds a bit puzzling to me in a sort of ordoliberal context, because before we discussed a little bit how individuality actually has to evolve or be fostered by certain institutions, or perhaps by certain social structures that encourage it, or that develop it. And so then to simply accept a kind of sovereignty just because we're committed to it seems to me like it's almost in direct tension with this idea that individuality actually has to develop. And I know that you yourself also work on versions of paternalism, which obviously touch on this issue, because how directly are you going to, or how serious are you going to take the preferences of people in society, or do you sometimes think that there's reason for questioning whether they are really either well-informed or even well-formed, right? Because that might also be a question that we can ask about preferences.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And in fact, if you sort of take the ordoliberal insight seriously, that there is sort of a reflexive relationship between, let's say, the social order, the institutional environment, and the individual, right? Let's say between structure on the one hand and agency, well, then you might have to enter into a very intricate discussion of how, just from a positive point of view, how this reflexivity plays out, right? And here, as you rightly said, the notion of endogenous preference and belief formation plays an important role. But B, also how we should maybe design institutions to shape individuals. And that is obviously a very difficult normative terrain, right? And in my own scholarship, I tend to highlight that if you allow for preference endogeneity and beliefs, meaning preferences are endogenous both to situations, to the framing of situations, but also to the larger socioeconomic environment, well, then we, as liberals, might need to take the idea of autonomy and agency more seriously and ask, what are actually the prerequisites for autonomous choice? And probably it's not enough to give people just information and then hope for the best, but things like education, like critical reflection on your evolving beliefs and preferences might become center stage, right? And it's actually a point that, I think Buchanan, of all people, also saw in his Natural and Artifactual Man, in his article of the late 70s, where he said, people with evolving preferences that are shaped by their social environment need means of imagination and valuation to navigate this landscape. And I think that's a deep insight that more liberal scholars should take up and actually flesh out what this means in terms of normative conclusions that we can draw from them. So I think that's an important point, actually.
Yeah. So does that, let me try to understand that as well as I can. Does that mean that we value agency more because precisely the fact that people are choosing freely and so on allows them to gain experience and gain exposure to different, I mean, perhaps even different types of consequences, but also to different types of life, different types of experiments? Or should we rather, right, sort of in an older paternalistic way, take away a little bit of agency and perhaps, right, nudge them in a direction that we think is broadly beneficial for them? Because you make a link to Buchanan, which is interesting. I think there's also a Hayek essay where he reflects on the very fact that we can only call a choice moral. I think he argues when it's a sort of voluntary choice. If it's not, then we also cannot evaluate the morality of it, because then we cannot really say that it's been chosen on its own. But yeah, that seems to me a very, very optimistic picture. On the other hand, that if only we let people experiment, they will always come up with, at least over time, what is best for them.
Yeah, no, that's well taken, your point here. I think that experiments in living is one answer to the challenge of preference endogeneity and belief formation. Why is that the case? Well, a core idea to explain preference endogeneity are actually cultural mental models, right? The idea, mental models are concepts, narratives, ideologies, etc., that basically shape the way we attend, interpret, remember, respond to information we encounter, right? Now, importantly, mental models affect people's preferences since they're sort of like cognitive devices that help people to categorize the world around them, right? Including, for example, how we rank products, people, political parties, lifestyles, etc. Now, interestingly, at any moment in time, obviously all of us, we hold multiple mental models, right? Depending whether we are, sitting in our office, whether we're in the supermarket, etc. And basically we can draw upon these mental models to interpret the situation around us, right? And interestingly, obviously the more I'm exposed to different environments, the more I'm exposed to different cultural mental models, right? And, I'm not just stuck in a narrow view, but I have multiple ways to, think about how to rank, products, people, parties, lifestyles, etc. Now, that's one answer how you can actually increase agency. And it's obviously an old Millian answer, right? John Stuart Mill would say experiments in living is a core prerequisite for individual agency. Now, it's also optimistic, right? In some sense. So if you look, for example, into the scholarship of Amartya Sen would say, well, yes, experiments in living is important, but what is also important is something he calls recent scrutiny. Now, he has been criticized for that, but in the sense that it's some form of elitist way of thinking like an academic about social structures. But I think his point is well taken. What is needed when we have a thicker understanding of agency is not merely freedom and the power to act, sort of a negative notion of freedom, but actually freedom and the power to question, reassess, the prevailing cultural models around us. And I think that's very important, because only then you can tackle the intricate problem of preference adaptation, right? That we adapt simply to our social environment. Now, the elephant in the room is, can liberals say something about an institutional structure that enhances recent scrutiny, right? Vis-a-vis these evolving preferences and the cultural mental models that we're exposed to. And I think that's at least part of my ongoing scholarship. How can you square this insight with a core liberal understanding of not telling people what to do and what to think?
Yeah. Okay. I want to switch gears a little bit because not too long ago, in fact, in 2021, a book that you co-edited with Tim Krieger came out called Ordoliberalism and European Economic Policy Between Realpolitik and Economic Utopia. So I want to talk a little bit about that sort of link that other scholars have also made between ordoliberalism and the European Union. So let me start with a very basic question. Is this a sort of descriptive claim that the European Union has a lot of ordoliberal elements, or is this more a sort of argument that the European Union would benefit from being somewhat more ordoliberal in its organization?
Yeah, I think there is there are voices on both sides. Some people arguing that actually when we look at the design and the evolution of the European Union, that ordoliberalism had, an influence in that. And others would say, well, it actually didn't have enough influence and the European Union should be more ordoliberal. Now, let me maybe start just historically. When we look at what happened in early European integration, well, we saw clearly that it was an ordoliberal project somehow, in the sense that, the idea was to aim at European integration through law, right? So there was clearly this, idea that particularly a market integration would be beneficial, and is an integration through law, and obviously the idea then of the common market and the four basic freedoms of the single market, including the free movement of goods, services, people, and capital, is very ordoliberal in the sense, right, that you create a competitive market order on the European level that then has a disciplining function on the political process, right? So in that sense, the origin story, if you want to call it that way, of the European economic community was ordoliberal, right? And many ordoliberals at the time actually favored that type of economic integration beyond the national borders. But now, when we look at the actual development of European integration, that took a slightly different direction, right? That many ordoliberals at the time, let's say in the 70s and 80s, actually had wished for. And the interesting thing is, it obviously became not just an economic, integration, but also a political and legal one that many ordoliberals saw critical at the time.
Yeah. So let me try to understand a little bit more. I saw this weekend a nice presentation on Jacques Rueff, a French thinker who was relatively close to the ordoliberals, and he was one of the first judges on the court. And in the presentation, it became very clear that he sort of believed in what you just called the sort of disciplinary role. So he gave an example of early sort of subsidies to the Deutsche Bahn, the German railway company, that would not be allowed under this sort of arrangement because it was favoritism on a national level, and that within the common market would no longer be allowed. And I think to this day we see elements of this. In Europe, I always love that the local football club cannot be bailed out anymore because of European rules. That's at least how the Dutch understand it. I don't think that's how all European countries understand the rules. But so there's interesting elements of that. But there's also often a link in sort of liberal circles to federalism. So would an ordoliberal model for the European Union move beyond merely shared legal rules and also include a kind of federal structure, or would that already be going too far, as you just indicated?
Yeah, and I think you find sort of voices in the ordoliberal camp for both. So those that want to stick to the project of economic integration, and those that favor some form of federalism on the European level. Now, the latter camp that favors some form of federalism or on the European level typically also understands that the European project is not just an economic project, but is also a peace project, right? It's a project that, particularly after the horrors of the 20th century, understands that also on the political level, there needs to be some form of coordination if we want to have a stability of the liberal order in Europe. And I think that's an important insight, right? Now, ordoliberals also of the second type that favors some form of, federalism on the European level are very quick to point out that we need to democratically legitimize that, right? And the problem that many ordoliberals see with the current project is that there's a lack in this democratic legitimization, that the European Commission, the European Council also has power beyond democratic legitimization in the European Parliament. And I think that's an important insight, just like, political insight and normative insight, that's a critique. And the other point is that ordoliberals are often quick to point out that the EU often violates the idea of subsidiarity, right? Which is a powerful idea. Basically, the idea that political authority should be located at the lowest institutional unit with competence for the issue at hand, right? And often when we have problems in the EU, ordoliberals point out we jump too high to solve local problems. And obviously you have the typical knowledge problems when you do that, right? But you also might undermine competition, right? Because you do not have sort of like competition between different jurisdictions, how to best solve local problems, but you try to have a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think that is a point that many ordoliberals actually point out, is sort of a failure in the construction of how problems, economic, political, social problems, are solved in the EU.
So if you present it as a sort of legal political project that's democratic in orientation, would then its major sort of enemy, or perhaps opposite, be a kind of a technocratic Europe? Is that how we should understand it, or?
I think that's right. And interestingly, obviously, you could, when you go back to the earlier part of our conversation, you could see a technocratic EU as being ordoliberal if they just follow ordoliberal principles, right?
Yeah.
But in fact, I think that the core problem is that sooner or later, if you have that take on the EU, then you will run into tensions with, core principles of liberalism, right? And interestingly, ordoliberals often were very good and are very good in pointing that out on the European level, but maybe they're less good in pointing that out on the national level when it comes to grounding, their national political and economic agenda in actually democratic legitimization. Now, the other point, that I just want to mention is that ordoliberals were quite critical with the implementation of the euro, right? And that's sometimes seen as a point where they made good arguments, and sometimes people think that they're Eurosceptics. But I think the interesting point here is that ordoliberals favored not a locomotive theory of the introduction of the euro, which would be you introduce the euro very quickly and then the political and economic structures will follow. But what they actually had or favored was a so-called coronation theory, right, where the common currency basically crowns a long process of real economic and political integration in Europe. And you can already see the ordoliberal idea here is one that, to some extent, relies on bottom-up approaches that are then accompanied by, legal institutional changes, and not the other way around.
So is one way of understanding that critique that Europe socially and culturally was not yet one, and yet we have one sort of economic regime, and those are bound to be in tension with one another in the same way that we earlier talked about tensions between the social and the economic order?
I think that's right. I think actually ordoliberals could have made that point much more forcefully. I think they often stuck to more economic arguments, what would be the right type of economic policy. And they actually often stuck to a more technocratic discussion, which is kind of ironic. But obviously what you just rightly said is that if you move too quickly on an institutional supranational level, you might miss what's actually going on culturally, socially, politically on the ground, right? And what we obviously saw over the last, 15, 20 years or so is a cultural backlash actually against the EU. It was not just a backlash against, the euro as an economic institution. It was also a backlash against this idea that, their European ideals that we as local communities, let's say a Catalan community on the one hand, a, Basque community, but then, a Flemish community, etc., need to follow, right? And I think that is a real tension. And you could see that the EU, including the euro, often was a technocratic project favored by liberal elites, right? And in that sense, there is a tension if you forget actually what are the political, social, and economic preferences of people in local communities.
We're nearly reaching the end, but I want to ask something now that I think I never thought about this before, so this might be a very stupid idea, but the classic liberal idea is sometimes that in the end, every liberal individual is a cosmopolitan, sort of rational, broad thinker who's probably not religious anymore and who has family ties, but is more dependent actually on ties of their own choice. But if you think about the evolution in the past 20 years, we've actually saw more regional identities emerge. We saw the Scots not being sure anymore whether they wanted to be part of the English project. We saw, of course, the UK not being sure anymore whether it wanted to be part of the European project. In Belgium, there's separatist movements. In Spain, there's separatist movement. So if I put this in a really weird way, were the original ordoliberals not smarter on this point, and did they not recognize the lasting importance of sort of regional ties and sort of conservative social values, if we put it that way?
Now, I think that's a good question to end, because it's a big question, and we can only have a broad philosophical answer. I can attempt to give a broad philosophical answer. Now, it's true that the sociological strand in ordoliberalism clearly saw the need to ground economic, political, and social institutional actions in local communities, right? And in that sense, it's very much Ostromian, right? It's following, this idea that a lot of solutions need to have, a lot of problems need to have social, local solutions, because they are actually addressing the needs and preferences of people on the ground, right? And I think that's very much part of ordoliberal scholarship that then, in the way, for example, the EU developed was often neglected, right? And in that sense, the EU, how it developed was not ordoliberal because it neglected these, needs and preferences of local communities. On the other hand, I also want to make a point that Alan Ostrom also points out, and I think that's also ordoliberal. You cannot just rely on evolutionary processes in local communities because you might end up in small-scale tyrannies, right?
Yeah.
If you want to fight for the idea of a liberal order, you also might need to fight for liberal ideals, including the protection of individual rights that exceed, local solutions. And obviously, if you think about many social, economic, and political problems of our time, you cannot just tackle them on the local scale, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, you both need to discuss these, supra-local institutional questions, while obviously respecting what's going on in local communities. And in effect, you could say probably this tension and some form of trade-off here is at the core of how ordoliberals should think about renewing their own agenda.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. This was a really wide-ranging conversation, I think, over ordoliberalism, but I greatly enjoyed it. So thank you very much, Malte, for all your insights.
Well, thanks for having me, Erwin, and I hope my answers were not too long and winded. But this is very much part of ongoing scholarship of myself, but of also a young group of ordoliberals. And we hope to renew this agenda and show that there's actually a lot of interesting insights if we do not just stick to the original ideas, but try to actually translate them and develop and advance them in the 21st century.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.